Thou blind fool, love, what dost thou to mine eyes, that they behold and see not what they see? They know what beauty is, see where it lies.
The fool dances through human history with remarkable persistence. From ancient tribal shamans to TikTok pranksters, from Shakespeare's licensed jesters to anime's lovable idiots, the fool has always captivated our imagination. But why? The fool is one of the most relatable, intriguing, and recurring figures in the world. There have been fools who have caused surprise and laughter since time immemorial. We worship folly by seeing it in people and in the world, and by willingly displaying it in ourselves. It is one of the timeless archetypes which we all inherit at birth. But here's a provocative question. What if the fool isn't who we think they are? What if, in a world obsessed with productivity and seriousness, the real fools are those who've forgotten how to play? Many of us suffer from the absence of the fool in our lives. Frenetic and upright, we take ourselves too seriously, trying so hard to conform to a world which promotes workaholism, efficiency, and productivity that we might as well be cogs in a machine. As William Shakespeare said, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." Forgetting that playfulness is a basic human need, we wonder why we so easily become bored and exhausted, losing all capacity for spontaneity, authenticity, and passion.
Remind myself that we must constantly look at things in a different way. See, the world looks very different from up here.
The antidote to this would be to give the fool archetype some space in our lives. To be in balance and not become excessively foolish and irresponsible, we need to develop the archetype of the sage, who, despite being wise, recognizes the limits of his knowledge and can laugh at himself every now and then.
See what no one else sees. See what everyone else chooses not to see, out of fear, conformity, laziness. See the whole world anew each day.
Archetypes are not part of a mechanical system, but pieces of life itself. Images that are integrally connected to the living individual by the bridge of the emotions. The character of the fool is complex, and various characteristics have been attributed to the fool. That he is dull-witted, inarticulate, unable to conform to the conventional standards of behavior, and that he has a natural simplicity and innocence of heart. The derivation of the word fool is the Latin falles, meaning a pair of bellows expelling empty air. Extended to people, it implies an empty-headed person with insubstantial thoughts. At the same time, bellows furnish the oxygen needed for combustion in much the same way that the fool fires us up. In 1511, the Dutch scholar Erasmus published In Praise of Folly, which became hugely popular and is a profoundly penetrating examination of the fool in Western literature. Imagine the audacity, a book where Folly herself steps up to the podium and delivers her own eulogy. Folly introduces herself, and since nobody ever praises Folly, she begins by praising herself, arguing that life would be dull without her. She makes a compelling case. Look around you. The most enjoyable parts of life all contain elements of folly. Folly criticizes everyone, and Erasmus's close friends warned him of the possible dangers of attacking the church. However, even religious figures found the work amusing. Why? Because deep down, we all recognize our own foolishness. Friendship and marriage contain a certain amount of folly, because we tend to overlook the defects of our friends and loved ones, and consider them small vices in comparison to other people. Intellectuals are especially foolish in their pursuit of knowledge, spending years going to the library, doing research, thinking that what they are doing is tremendously important, so that a few other intellectuals over of a century will read their book and think very highly of it. Folly compares philosophers to theater critics who unmask the characters on stage and ruin the actor's performance. They are boring and annoying. Philosophers don't seem to understand how the illusions that help make life bearable are useful even if they distort reality.
Ignorance is bliss.
The fool seems to be infinitely freer and happier than those who are burdened by wisdom. They are the life of the party. Fools always speak the truth because they lack the wisdom to craft lies and seek to manipulate others. In essence, there is nothing that can make life happier than the joy that accompanies laughter and play. Folly is not merely universal, but necessary and even desirable to humanity. To be a person is nothing other than to play the fool, and to acknowledge this very fact is the highest form of wisdom.
How would you like to die, Tyrion, son of Tywin?
In my own bed, at the age of 80, with a belly full of wine and a girl's mouth around my cock?
I love Tyrion. He forced me to notice how often the wisest characters in our stories are also the most foolish. This is no accident. The Fool represents a nostalgic return to a simpler way of life, a wisdom that comes not from the mind, but from the heart. Sometimes the down-to-earth and simple-minded in their purity of heart can penetrate to profounder truths than those encumbered with learning and convention. In the same way we sometimes sense a more resonant truth in popular proverbs than in rational exposition. Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky writes, "The wisest of all, in my opinion, is he who can, if only once a month, call himself a fool, a faculty unheard of nowadays." Think about it. When was the last time you heard an expert admit they might be wrong? The truly wise know the limits of their knowledge. In literature and film, wise characters sometimes depict insanity and madmen express wisdom. The oxymoron, wise fool, is a literal paradox where the character who is identified as a fool comes to be regarded as the beholder of wisdom. People sometimes accuse wise people of insanity in order to conceal their unwanted wisdom, either fearing the harsh words on many controversial topics or simply to punish them for speaking boldly. The archetypal wise fool is Socrates. Not only was his educational method based on exposing the folly of the supposedly wise, but he himself claimed that his own wisdom was derived from an awareness of his ignorance. Knowledge of ignorance is itself a kind of knowledge. As Shakespeare writes, "The fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool." Isn't this the great paradox of wisdom? The more we know, the more we realize how little we know. The fool's journey toward wisdom begins with this humbling realization. There are only two ways to be fooled. One is to believe what isn't true. The other is to refuse to believe what is true.
To them, you're just a freak. Like me. They need you right now. When they don't, they'll cast you out.
When there's an uncomfortable truth that needs to be spoken, and those in power are afraid to speak about it, it is usually the fool who steps in. There is something heroic about this. It is the fool who speaks a truth nobody else dares to utter, and this brings instant relief because people know it has to be said. Have you ever been in a room where everyone is ignoring the obvious, where social convention prevents anyone from stating what everyone knows to be true? This is where the fool shines. Generally speaking, we can distinguish between two types of fools. The natural fool, who lacks social awareness and occasionally utters the truth being unaware of social conventions, and the professional fool whose job it is to make harsh truths more palatable by disguising them with humor and wit. One follows his heart, the other his mind. The greatest fools are oftentimes cleverer than the people who laugh at them. The fool is fearless in speaking the truth. In fact, the great secret of the successful fool is that he is no fool at all. As the great English visionary artist William Blake writes, "If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise." Consider this. The most revolutionary ideas in history often seemed foolish at first. Galileo was mocked for suggesting the Earth moved around the sun. Early aviation pioneers were called crazy. The most transformative technologies often begin as foolish ideas rejected by the mainstream.
I hope they are watching. They'll see. They'll see and they'll know, and they'll say, "Why, she wouldn't even harm a fly."
The fool, the clown, and the trickster share similar traits. They are sources of humor, inevitably eliciting laughter, serving as catalysts for comic catharsis. However, they also express a duality: folly and non-folly, order and disorder, light and shadow.
Why so serious?
What may seem like a joke can in fact be a warning. Danish theologian and philosopher Søren Kierkegaard writes, "A fire broke out backstage in a theater. The clown came out to warn the public. They thought it was a joke and applauded. He repeated it. The acclaim was even greater. I think that's just how the world will come to an end. To general applause from wits who believe it's a joke. Professional fools can bring a sense of awareness to what is going on in the world and where we are headed. Many of them, however, come from a place of tragedy. The contradictory association between comedy and mental disorders, such as depression and anxiety, is known as the sad clown paradox, where comedy can act as a defense mechanism to remove suppressed feelings of rage and aggression. People may respond with laughter at the clown, yet harbor feelings of pity, fear, or repulsion, evoking ambivalent reactions. Some people, in fact, suffer from coulrophobia, the overwhelming fear of clowns. In this day and age, clowns are a constant source of horror in books and movies. Perhaps this is because the modern clown's role is always the same, to entertain others by being the subject of laughter, and he is not always successful at it. The clown has to sacrifice his well-being by always having to put on the same face and play the same character. This one-sidedness can take its toll mentally, and the clown slowly becomes enveloped by his shadow, the dark side of his personality. The evil clown archetype is best portrayed in The Joker, one of the most recognizable villain characters in popular culture. In medieval theater, clowns would not only make spectators laugh, but sometimes also snatch them off with them into a hellmouth, the entrance of hell envisaged as the gaping mouth of a monster, which scared the audiences. Thus, their light and dark sides were balanced. The fool and the trickster have a few psychological differences as well. Generally speaking, the fool is presented as an innocent or naive figure who wouldn't hurt a fly, while the trickster is intentionally deceptive and seeks to trick others and laugh at them. Think of the difference between Forrest Gump and the Joker, or between a child who innocently says something embarrassing and a con artist who manipulates others. Same archetype, vastly different expressions. The trickster loves engaging in what the Germans call Schadenfreude, literally harm joy, in which one obtains pleasure from learning or witnessing the misfortunes, failures, or humiliation of another person. A trickster may console others when they fail, and hide that internally he feels joy. When there is an opportunity to play a trick on another person, the trickster immediately seizes the opportunity. The fool, however, is not interested in laughing at a person, but rather laughing with the person, or laugh at himself. To laugh at oneself helps to break the ice because it not only removes one's own persona, but also the audience's social mask, allowing for genuine behavior. This courageous feat throws one in a vulnerable state which allows others to open up and receive a message more profoundly. While the fool likes to entertain others and is usually the butt of a joke, the trickster, on the other hand, seeks primarily to entertain himself, even if it is at the expense of others. The fool is able to have a sense of humor even in difficult situations, which radiates hope in others. In a tense atmosphere, the person who is hurt takes the risk to make a joke, even if it means making a fool of himself, not just to set himself at ease, but also to bring relief to others. When a person acts like a fool through some kind of outward action, it is immediately apparent to the audience. With the trickster, it is more ambiguous. He plays like a fool in order for people to fall into his trap. The trickster tricks others who never expect to be tricked. In medieval times, the court jester's job was to entertain the aristocracy in a wide variety of ways: music, storytelling, satire, comedy, or juggling and acrobatics. But they served a far more profound purpose. They were the only ones who could tell the king the truth without losing their heads.
You're talking to a king!
And now I've struck a king. Did my hand fall from my wrist?
It was believed that keeping a fool in the premises warded off the evil eye. This is no antiquated superstition. It represents a psychological truth of enduring value. It is usually a good idea to place the fool out front, where we can keep an eye on him. We must make room for the renegade factor in ourselves and admit him to our inner court, where he can bring us fresh ideas and new energy. Without the fool's blunt observations and playfulness, our inner landscape might become a sterile wasteland. During the Middle Ages, the Feast of Fools would be celebrated by the lower clergy on New Year's Day. To ensure society against unexpected uprisings of latent destructive urges, all conventions were temporarily suspended. The natural order of things was turned upside down. Sacred rituals were parodied in obscene fashion, church authorities were ridiculed, and all underdogs were allowed to give vent to year-long repressions of hostility, lust, and rebellion. These blasphemous celebrations were eventually driven underground by the church. Does this sound familiar? Consider modern-day carnivals, Halloween, or even comedy roasts. All controlled, sanctioned ways to temporarily invert power structures and release social tension. The fool also had an important role in the royal court and was given permission by the king to speak the truth. Both an insider and outsider The fool occupied a peculiar place at court as the one person able to ridicule the very person he served. In humor only, of course. Anyone who dares to challenge others or the status quo is considered a fool by those who are too afraid to speak out, and would never risk their reputation by being authentic. To make his special privileges known, the fool imitated the king's crown and scepter with a cap and bells, and a bauble, or fool's scepter. In the manner of a ventriloquist's doll, the miniature head of the bauble could say things that the jester might not want to say himself.
I am better than thou art now. I am a fool. Thou art nothing.
Because of their close relation to the king, jesters were free from punishment and allowed to speak without fear. Nevertheless, some of them went too far and were beheaded. Fools represent values which are rejected by the group because they oppose social norms and rules. They are seen as incompetent, frequently ostracized for their rebelliousness, and are thus social misfits. However, every group must have such a figure, because they are agents of change, and the liveliness of culture requires that there be space for figures whose function is to uncover and disrupt the very things that cultures are based on.
Verily, this vichyssoise of verbiage veers most verbose, so let me simply add that it's my very good honor to meet you and you.
Court jesters usually had some sort of physical deformity. They came from poor families and were financial burdens, but because of their unusual bodies, they were used as natural fools to create amusement. Deformities were looked upon as a special mark of the Lord, so dwarfs, hunchbacks, and the like were often chosen to be fools in royal houses.
Cut you in half. You'll do without a second thought.
That would make me the quarterman. Just doesn't have the same ring to it.
Shakespeare's fools are among the most profound characters in literature. They aren't simply comic relief, they're often the wisest characters in the play, speaking truths that no one else dares to voice. In Shakespeare's tragedy King Lear, the king's relationship with the fool is one of friendship and dependency. When the king is left with his knights, he is a terribly lonely figure and keeps asking where the fool is. The king wants the fool to accompany him everywhere, acting as his alter ego. The fool can be expected to reverse relationships between those dominant and those subservient, as he is placed in the paradoxical position of virtual outlawry combined with utter dependence on the support of the social group to which he belongs. Shakespearean fools, just like the fools and jesters of the time, use their wits to outdo people of higher social standing, but their characteristics are exaggerated for theatrical effect. Consider how relevant Shakespeare's fools remain today. When the fool tells King Lear, "Thou shouldst not have been old till thou hadst been wise," isn't he speaking to our own society's neglect of wisdom in favor of power and appearance? The myth of Parsifal, an old Arthurian legend, describes the journey that a boy must undertake to become a man. He is known as Parsifal, meaning pure fool, and lives alone with his mother. After seeing knights pass by him, he is marveled and decides to leave his mother in order to become a knight himself, and goes through many trials that initiate him into manhood. In the story, the Grail Castle is in serious trouble. The Fisher King, the king of the castle, has been wounded. His wounds are so severe that he cannot live, yet he is incapable of dying. He is rendered infertile, and his kingdom is barren. This expresses how the psychological wound manifests itself in problems in the external world. Every adolescent receives his Fisher King wound. It is the graduation from naive consciousness into self-consciousness. It is painful to watch an adolescent grow up and realize that the world is not just joy and happiness. However, his first contact with a wound is what later will be redemption in life. The wound becomes the doorway to deeper understanding. Every night there is a solemn ceremony in the Grail Castle. One of the maidens holds the Holy Grail, filled with wine, and each person that drinks from it is granted their deepest wish. The Fisher King, however, does not participate and is suffering alone. No further outward effort is possible if our inward capacity is wounded. It is perhaps the deepest form of suffering, to be right in front of beauty, happiness, and holiness, but unable to partake in any of it. Have you ever experienced this? Being at a party, surrounded by friends and laughter, yet feeling completely alone and unable to participate in the joy? This is the Fisher King's wound in modern form. The court fool had prophesied long ago that the Fisher King would be healed when an innocent fool arrived in the court and asked a specific question. One day, Parsifal finds a man in a boat fishing on a lake. It was the Fisher King. He asked if there was any place to stay the night, to which the Fisher King gave him the directions to the Grail Castle. Parsifal attends the ceremony, but the Fisher King is groaning in agony alone. The young fool, who refused to remove the homespun garment made by his mother, remembers her advice not to ask too many questions, symbolizing a mother complex. He forgets what he was taught by the godfather figure who trained him and does not talk to the Fisher King about his wound. The following day, he leaves the castle. As he turns around, the castle was nowhere to be seen. It took Parsifal 20 long and painful years to find the Grail Castle again. The inner castle is always there, but appears invisible to our eyes, unless we see the world with new eyes. Many of the continued stories say that after Parsifal revisited the Grail Castle, he asked the Fisher King, "Whom does the Grail serve?" Immediately he was healed and peace and happiness reigned over the land. The Grail is the center of meaning in human life, and the meaning of life is to serve the Grail or higher self. Jungian analyst Robert A. Johnson writes, "A man must consent to look to a foolish, innocent, adolescent part of himself for his cure. The inner fool is the only one who can touch his Fisher King wound."
Look at me, son. It's not your fault.
You would have me retreat from the battle as fast as you possibly can! On one condition. Anything. You never tell a soul that Don Quixote retreated from a battle.
In Don Quixote, which is often considered as the first modern novel, Spanish writer Miguel de Cervantes portrays a man who is driven mad after reading many books of chivalry. He decides to become a knight-errant under the name of Don Quixote. He rides on his weak horse and goes on to defend the innocent and defeat the wicked, only to do exactly the opposite. All this he does in the name of a peasant woman whom he idealizes as a princess, but remains unseen in the novel. The term quixotic refers to a person who is apt to be deluded, unable to distinguish reality from imagination, and pursues lofty and romantic ideals that are impractical. In a famous scene, the hero has an imaginary fight with windmills which he believes are giants. This is the origin of the idiom tilting at windmills, attacking imaginary enemies.
Do you see him? Oh, the great enchanter! Canst thou not see? What? A monstrous giant!
But here's the question that haunts us through Cervantes' masterpiece. Is Don Quixote truly mad, or is he the only sane person in a mad world? When he sees beauty and dignity where others see only the mundane, is he deluded or enlightened? Don Quixote recruits Sancho Panza as his sidekick and squire, a down-to-earth peasant who is puzzled by his master's grandiose fantasies, but being promised great wealth, follows him riding a donkey. Sancho's realism contrasts to his master's idealism. Don Quixote's good intentions, however, end up doing harm to those he meets, since he is largely unable to see the world as it really is. He is not only seen as a fool, but a complete madman. Despite his insanity, he is witty and at times seemingly sane, so long as he avoids the topic of chivalry. This may be a warning that even the most intelligent people can fall victim to their own foolishness. This brings in the question, is it better to know the truth and be unhappy, or live in a fool's paradise? In his novel, The Idiot, Dostoevsky explores this question to some extent. He portrays the ideal man, a positively beautiful individual in a morally corrupted and decayed world. The protagonist, Prince Mishkin, returns to Russia after spending time in a Swiss sanatorium, receiving treatment for epilepsy and idiocy, until the 20th century an actual medical term for neurological disorders. Starting with the train ride to St. Petersburg, he is thrown headfirst into the corruptness of society. The character appears different from other virtuous fools in fiction by emphasizing innocence rather than comicality. Dostoevsky writes, "First of all, this prince is an idiot, and secondly, he is a fool, knows nothing of the world, and has no place in it." Mishkin's open-heartedness, innocence, and lack of social experience is an instrument of satire, standing in sharp contrast to the corrupted, cold, money-hungry, manipulative, and egocentric society he finds himself in. The prince is frank, open, and unable to hide his true feelings behind a persona in order to impress others. He says what is on his mind, regardless of the social setting. This leads people to call him an idiot, even though he has deep insights about human nature and what it means to be a true Christian. The antithesis of Mishkin is Ippolit, a young atheist and nihilist in the final stages of tuberculosis and near death. He loses his will to live and rebels against society, nature, and God, and famously states, "It is better to be unhappy and know the worst than to be happy in a fool's paradise." Prince Myshkin, on the other hand, does not understand why someone would choose to be unhappy. Instead of philosophizing, the prince spends a considerable time with sinners, serving as their moral and spiritual guide. It is the small acts of kindness that truly matter in the world. Redemption is a key theme in the novel, to save the soul from the state of sinfulness through humility and compassion. In the most popular line of the book, Dostoevsky writes, "The prince assures us that beauty will save the world."
Congratulations. How do you feel?
I gotta pay.
The holy fool is one who is willing to risk ridicule, scorn, and rejection to follow the path of truth and love, no matter what the naysayers have to say. He possesses an integrity displayed in the courage to be himself in all circumstances, not needing to be defined by the responses of others or become conformist out of fear. He is free of judging others by values usually used, and is fully present to another human being. The holy fool is unstoppable, and is thus the most threatening to the authorities and powers that control and rule the world. Each person is worthy of God's love, and therefore each person has the potential to grow in the full life of the Spirit. To be a fool for Christ's sake derives from the writings of St. Paul, who claims that God has made foolish the wisdom of this world. He says of unbelievers that, professing themselves to be wise, they become fools. Foolishness for Christ consists in a rejection of worldly possessions in favor of a religious and ascetic life, even if it may result in humiliation and mockery from the crowd. The fool is the precursor to the Savior. Let no man deceive himself. If any man among you seemeth to be wise in this world, let him become a fool, that he may be wise. As we've seen throughout this journey, the fool is far more than a simple comedic character or village idiot. The fool is a universal archetype that exists within each of us, representing our capacity for wonder, spontaneity, truth-telling, and transformation. The fool walks the edge between worlds, between sanity and madness, between wisdom and ignorance, between the sacred and the profane. Perhaps this is why we're simultaneously attracted to and frightened by the fool, because the fool reminds us of the thin line we all walk in our lives. In our hyper-rational, productivity-obsessed world, we've often banished the fool to the margins. We've lost touch with play, spontaneity, and the wisdom of not knowing. Yet, ironically, it may be the fool who holds the key to our most pressing problems. The fool teaches us that it's okay not to know, that vulnerability can be strength, that speaking truth to power requires courage, and that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes wrapped in apparent foolishness. As T.S. Eliot reminded us, our exploring will ultimately bring us back to where we started, but we'll know the place for the first time. The fool's journey is circular, from innocence through experience and back to a higher innocence, from zero to completion and back to a new beginning. Perhaps the greatest wisdom is to embrace our inner fool, allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, authentic, and open to the great adventure of life, knowing that it is only by risking foolishness that we may ultimately find wisdom. And so, embracing the fool within isn't about rejecting wisdom, it's about redefining it. True intelligence isn't just about knowledge and caution, it's also about courage, curiosity, and the willingness to risk looking foolish in pursuit of something greater. After all, every breakthrough, every revolution, and every moment of profound growth began with someone daring to step beyond the limits of convention. So, dare to be the fool, because sometimes the fool is the one who changes the world. If you enjoyed this video and learned something new, please give it a like, subscribe for more thought-provoking content, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective.